Okay, welcome, good evening. Great to have an in-person event again in the premises of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. It's the first one after the pandemic. Slowly but surely we come back to kind of normal. So it's all a test, also this kind of hybrid events. Last time Stefan and I met, we were fully online, just the two of us here in the office. So it is great to have you here. Most of you, I think I don't have to tell, since you found us, I don't have to tell so much about Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. We are a German political foundation and non-government organization that is dedicated to civic education and political research. And one of our aims is to...
1 second, the sound they're not hearing.
Does it happen to be?
Speak up there.
Hi.
Here now.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Second start. Yeah, welcome again for the first in-person event in the premises of the Luxemburg Stiftung. Just started to, can somebody close the door? I hear myself.
I got it.
Yeah, the Luxemburg Stiftung is a German political foundation and a government organization. We are dedicated to political research and civic education. And the office in New York is the office for North America and the United Nations. And in this capacity, we are dedicated to foster the exchange between progressive, among a lot of other things that we are doing, but also foster the exchange between progressives on both sides of the Atlantic. Talking about that, of course, everybody is looking now on the midterms elections, and that's the issue for our panel today. I leave it to our wonderful moderator to introduce the panelists and just wish us all an interesting discussion and a lot of new insights. So enjoy the evening here and welcome to the audience online. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for organizing this event and for inviting us and having us. And thank you for joining in person. What a treat. And hello, Zoom comrades from afar. So yes, we are here to talk about the impending midterms together. More people joining. Hello, welcome. We're here to talk about the impending midterms and what that means for progressives and the left in the United States of America, and of course, hopefully some insights about what that means internationally. But yes, I am delighted to be joined by our panelists. We have Suzy Wurtz here. Oh, is it Wurtz or Wurtz? I think I've been speaking too much German, so
American
Wurtz. Who's an organizer with Lancaster Stands Up, which is in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. And that's an organization which focuses on organizing the working class in that region. We have Stefan Liebich here, who is a former Left Party parliamentarian from Germany, but who is now in America and is working as an honorific fellow at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung here, focusing on progressives in the US and Canada, and Susan Kang, who is an associate professor of political science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice with the City University of New York, and a member of the NYC Democratic Socialists of America, also known as the DSA. And then you've got me, your moderator. I'm Natasha Lennard. I'm a columnist at The Intercept, a professor of critical journalism at the New School, and do other bits and bobs. So hello, and thank you, everybody. Okay, November midterms are fast approaching, and we're here to talk about what the elections might mean for left-wing politics. What's at stake? Sites of leftist intervention, terrains of doom, and considerations beyond the electoral horse race. Midterms are typically understood as a litmus test for the popularity of an incumbent president. And for the most part, incumbents fare pretty badly They take the blame for pretty much any social economic issues, sometimes fairly, sometimes not fairly. But these midterms, as many of you watching might have come to understand, are being considered as something different, or at least something more. The president, various politicians, lots of commentators have used the term litmus test for the soul of the nation. I personally think nations don't have souls, so I don't really like the claim, but there's no doubt that a huge amount is at stake. No less than our already compromised democracy in this country, bodily autonomy, the ability for trans youth and adults to live and flourish, climate survival, and more. And at the same time, there are some openings for the left that we can have some optimism and hope around. Quick explainer, because not everyone is necessarily, especially our Zoom guests, based in the US and might not know the ins and outs of how midterms work or even what they are. And it just becomes a buzzword and there's too many assumptions of knowledge. I barely knew anything and I've lived here for years. But the midterm elections are held at the middle point of a president's 4-year term. And in terms of the federal government, the seats and offices that are up for grabs that elections are held over is the entirety of the House of Representatives in Congress. So that's 435 seats, a number I had to learn for my American citizenship test. So 435 seats. And then not all senators, but a large number. So 33 or 34 of the 100 Senate seats are up for grabs. And then similarly, in gubernatorial, and that's governor's races, 36 of 50 governors are facing re-election or election challenges. And then crucially, this is not just about major national level races. Some of the key fights and terrains that the midterms place into peril or potential are local. So state legislatures, municipal offices, mayoral races, and crucially right now, school boards. So we don't want to just focus on the federal government, of course. And I don't want to understate that left-wing struggle in the workplace, in the streets, and in our communities is not fully defined by elections. And I think we are in agreement here. So that's why I feel very lucky to be with these other panelists. That very swift introduction, hopefully swift enough, aside, let's start talking, everybody. I'm going to start with a question for everybody, and whoever wants to answer first, please do. But, you know, until pretty much a few months ago, it seemed like the Democratic Party was just doomed for these midterms, that we were going to see a red wave of the likes of 2010 during Obama's term when 63 seats were lost to Republicans. We thought that was going to happen, you know, this November. Cost of living crisis, inflation, all the promises of Build Back Better, the Keynesian Biden plan were just not being delivered. Things have taken somewhat of a turn, largely because of the Supreme Court's violent attack on reproductive freedoms, of course, galvanizing a lot of potential voters, but also some democratic deliveries, small student debt forgiveness, and some significant, but from a left-wing point of view, insufficient legislation. How do each of you see the landscape now compared to when you were viewing it maybe 6 months or a year ago? Maybe it's worth starting with Stefan, because you actually went on a tour of these here United States pretty much 6 months ago, and then kind of returning and surveying the landscape now. What did you see then, and what do you think has changed?
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. When I came to the US in February, and that was the time when I met Suzy in Lancaster, nearly every progressive person I talked to was totally desperate. It was like, nothing has worked, all these promises. And I think we have to look back a bit, because Joe Biden was, for us leftists, of course, not our favorite candidate. And most of us were in favor of Bernie Sanders, of course. And I think Joe Biden was smart enough to know that without the Bernie supporters, he has no chance to win. And both of them found a way to agree and make compromises for, I would say, quite progressive platform for the US. So in Europe, we would say it's a traditional social democratic program, but for here it was a big step. And I still remember, and it is worth to watch it again, his first speech. So he was elected, I think, by a lot of people, maybe not by all of them. I always meet these centrists who would say he was not running as an FDR. We wouldn't expect all these things, but I think a lot of people voted for him because of these promises. And then he gave the speech in April 2021 in the Congress, and it is really heartwarming to see how he was like, trickle down has never worked, and it was about the child tax credit and 12 weeks of paid leave and all these nice things. And I really believed him that he wanted to do this, but I think, and for my thinking is that this is the tragic. He had this very thin majority in the Senate, but two senators who were from the beginning on very clear that they won't go with him this way, which was obviously Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kirsten Sinema from Arizona. So they blocked the whole thing, the whole Build Back Better. And I was really angry about this. I'm not sure if you remember this when they decided about the $15 minimum wage, and Kirsten Sinema made this gesture. It was horrible. And also when they decided about suspending of the filibuster for one decision regarding the mass shootings or Roe v. Wade, it was not possible because these two people didn't go with a clear majority of the Democratic Party. And that was terrible. I have to add that I learned this month that there were more people hiding behind Manchin and Sinema. So it was not only these people alone, but they were the most famous ones. They were the faces. And I thought if he cannot deliver, the people who are not so much interested in politics like we are, they say, we gave you the House, we gave you the White House, we gave you the Senate, and you didn't deliver, they wouldn't vote for him again. And we have on the other side a terrible development within the Republican Party into a right-wing, some people would say fascist Trump sect. So it was not only about a question which party would win, it was a question about democracy. And I was really concerned. And then these things happened in the summer. So we don't know what will be the outcome, but there's at least a glimpse of hope again. I was really positively surprised by the referendum in Kansas about abortion. That made clear that even conservative women especially wouldn't follow this decision, and that may help. And also the decision by the Republican Party to nominate all these crazy right-wing weirdos, maybe this will help too. And then you mentioned it, a tiny bit they delivered. And I think if we wouldn't have seen the Build Back Better before, then we would more admire this now so-called Inflation Reduction Act, because it is still the biggest investment in climate the US ever did. It's not enough, it's too late, we expected more, but still. And also the decision about the minimum corporate tax, it is so important because it's an international agreement that we don't have these tax safe havens anymore. So things happen, and I would hope, I'm always an optimist, best case, 2 more Senate seats. We are no longer dependent on Manchin and Sinema, holding the majority in the House and having more real progressives in the Democratic Party in the House, and then Joe Biden could deliver all the nice things he has promised in his campaign. That would be great.
I think it's, God bless an optimist. Ooh, Suzy, what about you? You're kind of observing from being on the ground in a very red region. What have you observed in the last months? And where do you think we're standing now in comparison to some of those expectations?
Well, I think we're at a much, like, overall at a much better place. But like, I'm gonna go back too, but in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, we worked really hard to get out the vote for Joe Biden. Even though we had endorsed as an organization, we endorsed Bernie Sanders, majority of our members voted to endorse him, but we quickly switched to knocking doors and making phone calls for Joe Biden. He was one of our least favorites. And it was very disappointing to see last spring the inaction. The news about the Supreme Court leak was, it was not a shock to people who follow politics, right? We know that the right wing has organized for decades on this issue. But for a lot of people who think it was a done deal, having access to abortion, especially like, middle class people who live, in suburbs were shocked. And there was also like this sense of rage. I remember this one emergency rally we held about 48 hours after the decision was leaked, and the first thing we did at that rally was just collectively scream because we were so angry. But then there was also this expectation that came out of this rally that a lot of people were hoping that Democrats would step up in the moment, right? And protect our rights. And that didn't happen. We didn't see that happen. And for a lot of people in our area, it was the last straw. And people were forced to reckon with this vacuum of leadership. And a lot of people for the first time came to the realization that the leaders we're looking for are actually us. We're going to have to do the work to organize our neighbors. And it really this decision created an opportunity for everyday people to step up and, grapple with that and live up to the challenge. And so one thing that we did immediately, like I said, we held the rally. At that rally, we made a call for our Senator Bob Casey to support the Women's Health Protection Act, which would have codified Roe into federal law. And Casey and Manchin were the two pro-life, anti-choice Democrats in the Senate, and that was inexcusable for us. And so the following week, we had a sit-in at his office with, old ladies who had experienced life before Roe, had gone through all this, and now we're experiencing this lack of healthcare again. And there were college students there. There were even, men there. And we said we weren't going to leave his office until he came out and supported ending the filibuster and also supporting the Women's Health Protection Act. And he did. He's lived. And we're also seeing this huge surge of participation, especially right now with the midterms, from young people, college students. College students in Lancaster County organized rallies for choice right after the decision was leaked. And they're learning grassroots skills right now that are going to help us to enact change long-term in areas like Lancaster County. One last thing about this, the generation I'm from, we're very angry at the inaction from, old guard Democrats, but we also understand the stakes. We can't let people like Mastriano win. We can't let them erode our rights even further. And we also recognize that without strategic and disciplined tactics and a long-term path forward, which will, change the Democratic Party from within, we're not going to win. And so we're invested in building that and making inroads to do that within the Democratic Party.
Nice. Yes, and excellent work for the sit-in. Love it when that happens. Just for anyone watching who didn't know the reference to Mastriano, Doug Mastriano is the Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania, and the man was present at the January 6th Capitol riot. The man is what I, at least, would call a fascist. I know there are debates about these terms. Certainly a Christo-nationalist, much to fear. So, you know, that one of the more troubling races to watch certainly is in Pennsylvania. To you, Susan.
All right, I don't want to take up too much more time on this question, but
Sorry.
for me, what's interesting is, so 2018 was the midterm where the quote unquote blue wave happened. And one of the things that was affected was that Democrats and sort of the messaging about Trump, we have to stop Trump, was able to turn out and mobilize people who ordinarily maybe didn't vote, or it switched people over from Republicans to vote for Democrats. And so I see this as potentially a similar moment.
Right.
So the decimation of Roe is a moment in which people who ordinarily wouldn't turn out to vote, people who would be passive, and in general, midterms tend to have lower turnout than presidential years, are more likely to turn out. And so, as Suzy said, young people is going to love my answer to everything. And so, because typically they don't turn out, but now they have much more at stake, as you know, many of them are more in their reproductive years than say someone like myself. So I think that there's a great potential here, but you know, both the work of activists as well as Democratic like leadership is going to matter in terms of whether or not that's effectively used.
Yes, absolutely. So it kind of on that, kind of continuing that thought, are there specific areas that you are focusing on or looking at as kind of either key geographic terrain areas that you're focusing on for the midterms, or issue-based? Like, where are you focusing when you're both seeing how this is going to play out or doing the kind of DSA and various activisms that you're involved in?
Yeah, so in New York City, where I do my activism, we are mostly a Democratic majority city. So there's not a lot of state or congressional races that are very contested. Like there's not many, except for one in Staten Island that is got like a real Trump person running against like kind of a mansion person. So, you know, whatever, I'm not paying that much attention, but many people are. What is interesting to me is around New York, there have been congressional districts that flipped in 2018. So I was raised in New Jersey, and New Jersey was a state with quite a lot of Republican support. And then in 2018, I remember observers were saying, is the Republican Party dead in New Jersey? I don't know, I don't think so. But so there are a few seats in New Jersey, there's seats in Long Island that flipped blue in 2018. So seeing to what extent were those successful Democrats able to hold on to their seats? Like to what extent are they able to politicize issues like climate, politicize Roe v. Wade? That's sort of where I'm looking. But locally, I'm not. I might go out to Pennsylvania next doors for the Fetterman, for example.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about like what races, especially you know, the ones local to you think really matter, and in what way? Like, what are the real stakes here for working class people?
Right, so our focus, yes, Pennsylvania. I'm all about Pennsylvania politics because I live in Pennsylvania and there's high stakes right now. And our focus at Lancaster Stands Up has always been to connect issues that people care about to the candidates who will deliver for us. And so this year that looks like it does in other years. It looks like a lot of door knocking and a lot of phone calls and canvassing. And yes, abortion access is looming large, right? But also housing and income inequality is huge right now in Pennsylvania. People can barely pay rent in Lancaster County. And when you have President Biden passing legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act you talked about, and finally taxing wealthy corporations and stock buybacks, that's really attractive. It's attractive, it makes him look good, and it makes Democrats look good. And so specifically, we are having, so we're knocking doors for Fetterman, we're also knocking.
Do you want to just maybe for people who haven't been following
Yeah.
any specific, say who Fetterman is, and maybe just, give a quick demographic sense of Lancaster County, what kind of, is it rural, is it metropolitan?
Yeah.
Just so people have a sense of kind of like envision where you're door knocking and who.
Okay, so Republican County, and there is a blue city in the middle.
Okay.
So Democrats win in the city. It's majority people of color city, and the rest of the county is very white and very Republican. That's where I live.
Right.
And Republicans or Democrats rarely even run, and outside of the city. But John Fetterman, he's running for Senate, and he's running against a TV celebrity, Dr. Oz, who the joke is he's not even from Pennsylvania. He doesn't know what spotted lanternflies are, I think.
Never killed one.
Probably not. And a person like John Fetterman, like with Biden having passed this, and then John Fetterman being very popular and very relatable, wants to pass marijuana legislation, wants to raise the minimum wage, is supportive of healthcare for all. He's attractive, and we are knocking doors for him. And we're also knocking doors for Josh Shapiro, who's running for governor against the Christian nationalist, Doug Mastriano. And honestly, Shapiro the only thing standing between losing rights for workers and for families, and for students, because Mastriano has promised to erase all of those as soon as he becomes governor. But yeah, we're out there knocking doors every Saturday and making phone calls every Thursday.
And how do you feel it's going? Like, when you're getting feedback from people, I know it's a kind of often feels like quite a thankless door in your face sort of practice, but yeah, you can. How are you feeling?
Actually, it's not really surprising to me, because when I go to the door, I don't say I'm with the Democratic Party. I say I'm with Lancaster Stands Up, and we are known as a working class organization that speaks up and invites working class people into the political process. So we don't have to say we're from the Democratic Party. We're Lancaster Stands Up. And I was knocking doors last Saturday, knocked the door of a Republican, elderly lady, and had this great conversation, listening conversation mostly. And she recited all the typical Fox News Republican talking points of, there's too much crime, and the Democrats are going to make it worse. And then she said at the end of our conversation, I don't know if I can vote for the Republicans this year because they're going to ban abortions. And I asked her to tell me more about that, and she said it's such a dangerous and personal issue. It should be between women and a doctor, and that's how we can talk about it. Everybody deserves to have accessible health care and to be kept safe and make their own private decisions.
Yeah, no, it's if the Democrats end up winning and it really does turn on reproductive rights, I'd argue that it's deeply unearned, but very lucky. Stefan, I know that you're not necessarily working as an activist from an American context, but yet you are here and engaged with how progressive are organizing in the US. Where are you focusing for the midterms in terms of, the races you've got a keen eye on, the ones that you think have the greatest stakes, the ones you're maybe the most excited about, given the optimism thing that you were mentioning?
Yeah, I would like to go on with my optimism. And I look at this election, of course, with my background as a politician who comes from a parliament. So it's not only enough to have a strong Democratic Party, it is important what kind of Democratic Party we will have in the Congress. And a few days ago, there was a nice webinar organized by Bernie Sanders or his team or all of them. And he invited 6 interesting candidates who may win their districts. Real progressives, democratic socialists, some of them, and I will mention them a little bit later. But if we go back in the history, we all remember what a big success it was when AOC did win her seat. And they started as a squad of 4. Then 2 years later, 2 more came, so they are now 6. And if they would really have 6 more, that would mean doubling the real progressive part of the Democratic caucus. And we already have a progressive caucus within the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, which is close to half of the Democrats. We have to mention here that some people just describe themselves as progressives, but even this is a big step, because I remember the times when it was a big disadvantage to be described as a progressive. So if we would have these 6 more people, that would be a big step. And those are Becca Balint from Vermont, Jonathan Jackson and Delia Ramirez from Illinois, Summer Lee of Pennsylvania. Of course, that was a big success because I followed this race and we could all see how the money was spent against her, and she did still win, and that was great. Greg Casa in Austin, Texas, Maxwell Alejandro Frost from Florida. So, and these are all very nice people. I didn't know all of them before, but after this 1 hour, Bernie was like, I'm so motivated now. I feel 10 years younger. And he mentioned the time when he was first time elected, that he was very alone and isolated there. So again, it's not enough, but those are the races I will follow. I hope I can be in Austin on election day, and maybe I can talk to Greg Casa, or at least I can report, because for Germans, Texas is like a cliche of Americans. So like some Americans always ask me about Lederhosen, Oktoberfest and Dirndls, which is totally not German. It's a tiny part of Germany. Sometimes it's the other way around. So Texas is for a lot of Germans. America, and if I could report back that in the capital of Texas, a Democratic Socialist would be sent to the Congress, it would be a big thing. And we in Germany, we need now a little bit optimism from the left side, because it's not so well for us there. So I look forward to it.
Die Linke Party has not been doing very well.
No.
But it's not Stefan's fault. It's amazing. It's here. Let's continue on that theme of, you know, what type of Democratic Party are we talking about? And, you know, those who do follow US politics from abroad quite closely will probably be aware that, you know, it's a strange beast, the Democratic Party. And AOC said a few years ago, quite rightly, that in like no other country would a set of parties exist such that she were in the same party as oil baron Joe Manchin. It's a very strange umbrella from Democratic Socialist left flank to, you know, what would be standard Conservative Party members in countries like the UK, Britain, and Germany. So how my panelist friends seeing this coalition standing now, you know, there have been, you know, this kind of fragile coalition has managed to pass some legislation, compromised or not. You know, I think if there are more DSA supported or progressive candidates elected, great, but that's still, you know, 12 of 435. It's a lot of people. How are you seeing this coalition play out, and what kind of hope or dread do you have of the balances in play?
So this is a question that, you know, keep us all up at night. So to me, if the Democratic Party whoever sort of thinks about these issues, whoever's operating at an elite level, doesn't take the left flank seriously, they have nothing to do but lose elections, right? Because so I read somewhere not that long ago that Gen Z and millennial voters are actually now the majority of voters in the US, right? So I'm like tail end Gen X, there's very few of us. We don't have good politics. We still believe in capitalism. And then we've got the, boomers who are, they vote, they're very like good voters, but they're not numerically the majority anymore. And so if the Democrats aren't winning, it's because they're not engaging this base. So if you look at the polling data, young people like, below 40 overwhelmingly support the issues that the Democrats are the only ones who support, right? So things like healthcare, things like, childcare, family leave. You'll find like the most interesting hodgepodge of like tech bros who want Medicare for all, right? As well as sort of socialists, things like, climate. The list goes on and on. And so failing to deal with this means the Democratic Party loses its most natural constituency and they have no one to blame but themselves.
Right.
And so ultimately, I read about this like secret meeting in 2020 in which like evidently Abigail Spanberger, who was elected in the blue wave in Virginia, a moderate Democrat, like blamed the losses of Congress on AOC. And it's all socialist Democrats' fault, right? But in fact, no, it was the fault of that Democratic leadership, their mainstream, whoever speaks and represents the Democratic leadership for failing to speak to people's issues. And so ultimately failing to take this and center the concerns of the left and of the young people means the Democrats will lose because the right, they're not the numerical majority, but they're very inspired by the righteousness of their cause. And they take political institutions seriously.
Yeah, they're probably better at power because they don't mind minoritarian rule.
And they don't mind, the dirtiness of politics.
Right. No, I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, absolutely. Democrats failing to actually do the one thing they could do to win.
One neat trick, guys.
Or just blame the left. In terms of when you're kind of observing and actually having to interact with this kind of fragile coalition, and when you meet different kinds of Democrats and are obviously pushing from a left-wing standing, or at least a working class people standing, how are you observing that kind of coalition, and what kind of concerns or indeed hopes do you have?
I'm with him. I'm very optimistic. So like the coalition as it exists today, too small yet. Would love to see it grow. However, that won't happen unless there's some really, really heavy organizing on the ground. And there's a couple parts to that. And one of those is electoral work, right? Another part in the electoral work serves to really train people on like basic organizing skills, like grassroots organizing skills. And we saw this happen in the Bernie campaigns a lot of people here probably volunteered for the Bernie Sanders campaign and came into politics that way. We're not going away. We are now organizing our communities. We are winning elections. We are organizing our workplaces. And it's going to take all of those things together to actually build a coalition within the party we need.
Right.
And we're seeing it happen, yes, at the federal level, but also at the state level. I mean, we have in Pennsylvania, well, Summerlee is leaving to go to the federal level, but we have a progressive coalition within our state house right now in Pennsylvania, and adding more every year. And these are people's champions and working class champions who came from the people, came from an organizing background, or were recruited by grassroots organizations, and these grassroots organizations help get them elected. And now we're able to, experience what co-governance means and what a government for the people actually means.
Yes, good. No, completely. And I do think, thinking about how state legislatures and what the kind of makeup of them are determines so much about lived politics, as you see when the right has held and won and become increasingly more fervidly right-wing in state legislatures, how much people's lives can be ruined. I have a question for Stefan about a sort of playing off your talking about young people and the demographic that we can hopefully rely upon, if only if it's listened to. In Germany, we've seen people of, millennials, my generation, younger generation, Gen Z, take a quite unpleasant turn towards the FDP, which is the sort of like neoliberal, it is the party for the tech bro. And they've done incredibly well with young people. So of course, like the assumption that young people will maintain and carry forth democratic socialist, if not kind of further left concerns, concerns for the broader good. We're not seeing that in Germany, and it's obviously a risk anywhere. What do you see as happening there, and in comparison to what maybe you're seeing with young people here? How do we avoid that?
I think we in Germany, we've been in a very specific situation in the last years, in the Angela Merkel years. So when I go abroad and I talk to people, I have to tell them that Angela Merkel was actually not a social democrat. She was a leader of a conservative party. But internationally and even in Germany, she was seen like, yeah, she's a very apolitical, in the middle person, and she's managing our country quite well. So it was very difficult to have a real political fight between left and right forces. Unfortunately, right now, the goals of the Biden government are more progressive than the goals of our government. We have now a social democratic-led government with a coalition with the Green Party and the neoliberal FDP party. They would never say, pay your fair share, we want to increase taxes, trickle down has never worked. This is not the politics. Olaf Scholz was elected maybe a tiny bit because of his promise to increase the minimum wage, but that was the only real left progressive point in his campaign. Actually, he was elected because he was the best copy of Angela Merkel in the campaign. So we have really to restart a political debate. And right now, to be honest, it's not the best moment. We don't have this topic here because the war, the terrible war Russia has started against Ukraine, causes a lot of problems in Germany too, rising prices, rising energy prices, and we do have now fights, but it's not really, it begins. So our government gives like answers to help the people to less, protect the companies too much, and we have a beginning resistance. So this is kind of a fight we need, but it is really too less. I want to go on with one point comparison in comparison of the system here and ours. When I went on my trip, I met nice comrades in a pub in Philadelphia, and they talked to me about how jealous they are about our system, because we are in our nice left party without all the Bidens and Mentions and all the centrists, and that we should that we have it better there. And I told them the difference is, yes, that's true, but also we can even find within our little tent a lot, but we are not forced to make compromises in this big tent, which is here the Democratic Party, because the Social Democratic Party and the Green Party, they can always go to the guys from the other tent, and that's what they are doing. So the left party is not part of the compromises of our government. We are in opposition. So I won't make a decision which system is better, but I want to bring up, it is unpleasant. I can understand this, to fight the whole day with the centrist and right-wing Democrats, but still, the tiny group of leftists in the Democratic Party, I would say they are more influential than the left party in Germany. So even if we may feel better from time to time, but we have to
Yeah.
have this in our mind. And also, if we talk about this coalition, the Democratic Party, from the historical background, I did a speaker's tour about the progressives in the US in the last month, but if we go back and look, when the left was as strong as the left in the US is now, we have to go far, far, far back to the last century, the 1930s, 40s. And I remember when we opened this office here 10 years ago, that was the time after Occupy Wall Street and Zuccotti Park and the Bernie Sanders campaign, when it starts again. So it's not enough, but it is still, I would say, going in the good direction.
Yes, again, more optimism. Also, I gotta do this. If anyone of the German audience is interested in what has happened in those last 10 years of the American left, my husband wrote a book called America's Neue Linke, Uprising America's Neue Linke, and I highly recommend it. Got a plug. Let's continue talking about though what has been, historic, unprecedented shifts that might be from abroad, from places with stronger labor protections, stronger historic unions, including public service unions, even the fact of like forming a union, they'd be like, well, that's just normal. But obviously right now in the US, we are seeing some of the most potent and incredible labor action. Not in the last 80 years, really, since the very brutal anti-union Taft-Hartley Act, are we seeing labor power grow at the speed and in all the different tactical ways that it is, from wildcat union formations, major strikes, threats of infrastructural strikes, everything like that. I'm curious, how you feel this is or isn't informing some of the more electoral politics that kind of obviously in play in the midterms. Are even the left flank progressives answering this, speaking for this enough, speaking in coalition and complicity with this sort of labor work sufficiently? And yeah, how do you think that electoral politics is answering to this quite powerful moment of labor organizing? Maybe
So this is a question that I'm actually trying to do research on.
Oh, great.
But anyway, so 70% of Americans polled, the highest since like the 1960s, I believe, support being in a union, and a similar large number want to be in a union. But union density is at a very sad, like 10%, maybe a little bit higher, much higher in the public sector. I'm a union activist myself at CUNY. So this is a big thing. This is a big question, right? One of the things that scholars and people like myself are curious about is how, when you also look at the data, right? I'm not actually a public opinion person, but I hang out with them. Support for unions has like a very heavy partisan component, right? So if you break down Democrats, Republicans, it's almost overwhelmingly Democrats who support, have this increase in support in unions over time, and Republicans kind of stay quite low. So that's a major part of it, which is that the people who are organizing unions probably support the things that we all support, or at least many of them. And the people who, are engaged in these struggles also engage in a political socialization as well, right? So there's also research about how important trade unions are, because their members are more likely to vote, and they're more likely to support democratic institutions, right? They're less likely to storm the Capitol. Right, they're more likely to think that civil liberties and basic rights for everybody are important, even in places like Pennsylvania, where they, you're going to get like union activists who vote Republican consistently, right? But on average might vote for Democrats a bit more than the general population. So there's something about unions that's very specific, very important for democracy. But then you see how this breaks down. I think that one of the things I think about is whether or not young people who are organizing in unions trust the union organizing process more than electoral politics. And so one of the things, there's a scholar at Cornell, her name is Kate Rothman, I'm sorry, Rothenheimer or something, I apologize for not knowing how to say your name, who actually has a report or a data set, supposedly that's going to be coming out soon, looking at all the organizing that's happening at workplaces outside of the official channels, like the National Labor Relations Board, which is like a very cumbersome institution where people go to officially certify
Mhm.
elections. So we hear about unions elections being filed, we don't hear about tons and tons of informal union organizing work that's happening. And I think it's just as important as the official stuff. So I think that perhaps, and I'm sort of curious what the long-term effects will be, that as like, AOCs and as sort of the left wing of the Democratic Party champions these issues, and tries to push for better institutional arrangements, perhaps young people who are more likely to organize unions than vote might want to make those additional steps. And of course, that will require a lot of engagement, a lot of this grassroots activism that Suzy has been speaking about. I don't think it's an automatic process.
Right, yes, and yes, no, and it was, of course, legislation that helped make unions break down so much, so it's like we can never pretend these are disconnected struggles. I think obviously, yes, you must, in terms of being in Lancaster County, working, I presume, with a lot of people who are involved in labor organizing, be watching this kind of play out in different ways on the ground. Yeah, how are you seeing the kind of growth in labor power both reflect and be reflected by more kind of electoral representative political organizing?
Yeah, so this is actually a fun question for me because we've had so many different strikes in the last year in Lancaster County, including the Kellogg's. It was a national strike from Kellogg's plants. We have a Kellogg's plant in Lancaster County, and a lot of grassroots organizations in Pennsylvania, including the Philly DSA, came out to march on the picket line. I took my kids out there a couple times with food. And like the conversations you have makes it very, very clear at those picket lines that the workers who are striking notice who marches with them and who goes inside to talk to the bosses. And they'll tell you who does. And so they told me John Fetterman came out, and that's also attractive for for a candidate to support unions. And I mean, Susan, I don't want to reiterate what you said. You said it really well, but the Democratic Party right now has a really big decision to make if they're going to go all in for unions, for working class people, and for work, democracy in the workplace, or are they not? And there's kind of like this crossroads that they have to decide on. And I feel like all the strikes and all the, the just forming unions, even that is forcing that decision ahead. And sooner or later, probably sooner, they're going to have to make that decision. But the good news is Biden has come out as being very, very pro-labor, more pro-labor than probably any president in my lifetime or my parents' lifetime.
Yeah, no, it definitely didn't used to have to be a defining characterization of a Democratic president at all under neoliberal consensus. Let me see time. How are we for time? Good. So I think I have two more questions. One is more open-ended. This one is a little bit more specific. And then if there are a couple of audience questions after that, we will be able to take them. So just over 2 years ago, and I think this is a kind of similar question about grassroots and ground up organizing and mobilization and how it is or isn't being responded to by representatives. So you had up to 26 million people in the streets following George Floyd's execution. And at the time you had these really pathetic displays from establishment Democrats in sort of timid, performative support. If people remember Nancy Pelosi and other Democratic leaders kneeling in African kente cloth, and it was awful. Just put it away. But really, really quite swiftly, you had any calls to defund, let alone abolish the violent institution of policing, completely jettisoned. Those who were calling for it, those who were calling for their lives to matter, were told that they were, hurting Democratic Party's chances, that we were the problem. And that kind of has continued the pace. We see this play out in the midterms, in congressional packages being organized right now, massive pro-policing messaging, huge race to the bottom between Democrats and Republicans in terms of who can be the most law and order, mythical nonsense around crime that is allowing the Republicans to actually set the fulcrum of messaging. Full hog on mass funding for police, and only a few, very few, left flank of the Progressive Caucus standing up and saying, like, no, we want to listen to the people that did take to the streets potently in those numbers, and please, can we put some sort of break in this propaganda? And yet here we are, and I think, for me at least, I think it's been a like vile betrayal of millions and millions of people. And it speaks again to what are we going to see from this fraught coalition? And when we were talking before, you sort of made a really important point I'd love you to elaborate on, of what the Democrats are doing here, and what's the stakes here if they continue to treat blue lives as a real thing and black lives as expendable.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot because I was on the streets. It was the first time I really left my house, other than grocery shopping, during that time of the pandemic. And it was, a very powerful, beautiful moment of solidarity. I think many of us misunderstood the way in which the right would truly use that moment as a way to distract from the way, the devastation of the pandemic. And the fact that the Trump presidency had been a disaster, by poisoning the word defund. And sorry to be like a whole person again, but if you look at the data, if you ask people to support defund, people didn't like it. People didn't like it in 2020 or 2021. But if you reframed it as, how about if we take resources and spend more resources on like crime prevention and like, mental health services and like youth programs, right? It's like the numbers are 30 people you surveyed are like, that's fantastic. Let's prevent crimes, right? So I think that one of the things that I think Michelle Wu, when she ran for mayor, people were like, oh, she's a defund mayor. But in fact, she was like, I'm not going to let you talk about it that way. These are the things I support. So she was very good at shutting down an attempt to make her very reasonable, very popular position seem like toxic. I think that when Democrats let the right dictate, then they can never win. Right. Because ultimately what ends up happening is that the constituencies the Democrats are meant to serve. So the political science literature says that the Democrats aren't really an ideological party. They're just kind of like a coalition party, which includes labor, finance, various like racial and ethnic groups, immigrants, women with bodies, that kind of thing, LGBT community. So which I'm obsessed with Eric Adams, as we all are, and
he's the New York mayor, former cop,
right? And so
very cop.
What you get is Eric Adams claiming to be the future of the Democratic Party. Somebody who claims that his knowledge as a transit police, right? Not exactly somebody who's on the homicide, someone having somehow giving expertise to quell this this crime wave. But of course, it hasn't been true. But it means that he can create a set of political conditions in which nothing should be funded except for police. Right. I like want to cry when I think about how New York City schools are being defunded. I have two children who attend public schools, but then how many millions of dollars were spent in 2020 on police overtime to just like stop us from existing? And so it's not a winning combination. And if anything, crime and loving police is a Republican thing because it's about distrust. It's about like, don't trust the government, institutions cannot like protect us, we shouldn't trust each other. The Democrats aren't going to win on that message because we're not the party of small government. We're not a party of distrusting our institutions. We're the party that believes in one of the ideological things that we're supposed to all believe as Democrats is that democracy with the small d is good and that elections are good, right? And so if we continue to sort of lean into this crime, then we're going to end up having a society that fundamentally distrusts each other, and democracy can't work in these conditions. So it's just lose all the way down.
Yeah, I'm curious how you're seeing this play out, because especially when you're in red region, predominantly white people, not in the metropolitan area, whether this has come up as an issue, whether people are like, no, but the crime thing, and they all want to do crime everywhere, and how you kind of deal with that and respond to that.
Yeah, we actually did some work on, when the George Floyd uprisings happened, we did some pretty serious work on, police transparency and police violence, even in like white areas like where I'm from. And we were very careful not to say we want to defund the police, even though they get close to 60% of our budget every year. And they earn a wage that's pretty far above the median wage of people living in our small town. And at the same time, we hired a new police chief who was very much invested in this idea of being a good cop. And to his credit, he has really advocated for mental health services and for, more police officers who are, riding bikes instead of like in cars, and who you would be able to call if there was a crisis. So that's good. However, there hasn't really been, like when you talk about this huge national conversation about defunding the police, we of course didn't say that, but we also knew that our community wanted some type of promise from our police department that what happened in Minneapolis wouldn't happen in our town. And we organized around that. And we were able to win on that. It took us about 8 months, and we won on that issue of more transparency from our police department, and a way to give feedback if there were to be, altercations with an officer. But all in all, it's been pretty quiet because our, where I'm from, it is majority white. We don't have to worry about, our life being threatened by a police officer like, our Black and brown brothers and sisters do.
Yeah, no, completely. And yeah, so Stefan, I know you were obviously, this was still a very pertinent, relevant, always is, but must have still been in the discourse, hopefully, and I mean, it should be more now, but when you were on tour earlier this year, how did you see organizing communities and progressives talking about this, and, progressive candidates managing or failing to manage with sufficient response and support or solidarity or lack thereof?
To be honest, it is not easy coming from Germany to really understand this conversation here, because we as leftists are, of course, critical with our police too. But I would say our police force are much better educated. We don't have this, so we do have racial profiling right now, but there are not these terrible cases like George Floyd that are part of our normal discourse. So coming to this place, you're talking to left activists. I learned even within this left progressive community that here was a controversial discussion about it. I remember when I was in California, some would say we are in favor of defunding the police, but we shouldn't put it on the top of our lists in campaigning, because if we do, we won't get elected and cannot do the good stuff we want to do, even in reforming the police. And I could understand this. And I'm not a person who can judge this debate. What I want to bring in here is an actual decision from yesterday, because right now when we are talking about this in the House of Representatives, they are deciding about a thing called Invest to Protect Act. And it is what you would imagine. So from a mainstream Democrat, Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, It is like showing that Democrats are on the side of the police force. And yesterday there was a statement by the Progressive Caucus, by Pramila Jayapal and Ilhan Omar, and they explained about the negotiation process and what they could put in. So I'm convinced that they will decide this today. But what they mentioned was that they have now new trainings in the law for de-escalation, data collection regarding the behavior of police, which is important training for unarmed first responding forces, prevention programs, such things. So I would say this is not the point where I would say I'm the optimist. It is more like having a little bit of water in the glass, but this is a very long way to go. And we should be honest with ourselves, which fights we are about to win as progressives right now. And I don't see that this is the one we are winning right now. We can do compromises like this. We can prevent the worst. We can make things a little bit better. But and you mentioned this with the polls. Obviously, the threat made by the right wing was working and is working, and so we have to find. I would say, but I'm not here to judge. To find a better way to communicate for the things we want to do, and not walking into the trap they made for us.
Right. And I think we're fading black. So yes, obviously we've been focusing on this coming November and everything around it, but obviously the work doesn't stop there, and that's been referenced in a lot of ways. But my last question for everyone before we open to the audience is, you know, whatever may come, and to be clear, it is not totally unlikely that the Republicans take the House, especially given the state of the economy, which is, you know, pollsters tend to say, and they can be wrong, but usually is the determining factor of how midterms turn out. And it's not good in that sense, even if the mass red wave is prevented. But, you know, whatever the results, will you be putting your energies November onwards?
So here in New York City, the DSA is very involved in state politics.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people in the US, progressive leftists, focused on the state as a potentially fruitful side of struggle, because the federal system is so messed up. The institutions are set up in a way to amplify the power of, like, you know, conservative abilities. So I'll continue to focus on things that are not done at the state level. You know, we could fight for things like, you know, universal health care here in New York. We could fight for better protection for tenants, because, you know, housing prices are out of control. We'll fight for things like fully funding our schools, our transportation system. In New York, we have atrociously low levels of renewable energy. We'll fight for a green New York and for fighting climate change. We're about to enter hurricane season, where unfortunately New Yorkers last year were killed during floods. And so we have to fight for a New York that's safe. When we think about public safety, we don't think about the threats that people face, you know, outside of crime. And, you know, just a mile from my house, like a 2-year-old child and his family drowned. So, you know, this happens in New York because we're not creating a New York that's safe for everyone. And so that's what I'll continue doing at the city and the state level, right? So, and also I think there's elections in 2023. City council, I guess I'll pay attention to that as well.
Yeah, and when you do see you know, progressive left-wing flank politicians at the state level get things done, it's extraordinary the difference it can make in terms of basic tenants laws and things like that. Yeah, no, sounds like a good continued struggle.
Stefan's optimism.
Yeah.
Keep going with that.
And Stefan, what about you? What's the work?
I would say it really depends on the election result. So being one moment pessimistic, if we have the worst case and the House is lost to the Republicans, and maybe even the Senate, then the real threat is, do we have a with all these failures, do we have a democratic system after the next presidential election? So if this would happen, then really the fight should be protect the democracy here. So I hope, and I don't think that it will come, but that could be an option. If the Democrats would win in both houses, then of course the fight would be to have a stronger left within the Democratic Party. And here I would agree, we have to do as much as we can on the state level. And I want to quote here the former chairman of my party, the party Andreas, and I joined in
1988.
and I was 1990. So our chairman, Lothar Wiesky, used to say, local politics is the root of left-wing politics. And sometimes the people are bored and they talk more about the federal parliament and whatever, but that's true. This is a place where the things happen, the people know each other, and if we are strong there, then we can even survive a crisis. So I want to bring up here one example. I went to Hudson Valley. I met Sarah Hana Schwester. She is a democratic socialist. She lives there in a little town, and it is very likely that she will be elected to the state House of Representatives, State Assembly. And then she would be one of the very few socialists not being elected here in Brooklyn, New York City, but in a rural area. And that is important, that we are present there, like in Lancaster County. And so I would think these things are maybe not so much for the headlines, but they are an important base for the future for the progressives, I think.
Yeah. And I suppose, yeah, and passing the same question to you, you've given a sense of what the ongoing work entails. But yeah, when the door knocking is over in terms of elections, what are you going to be focusing on in terms of the struggle?
Really exciting stuff. So in 2018, we ran a congressional campaign with Jess Kang, you might know her, and we, for the first time in Lancaster County, had this huge movement of people getting involved in politics. And while she didn't win, she won the biggest vote share in any, like all the precincts in Lancaster County, and in that district that any Democrat had ever won, and flipped a lot of Republicans to vote for her. And the folks who organized with her went on to run themselves, like run for office themselves, won, and we ended up flipping 5 different borough councils the next election cycle. We want to do that again. And right now we have some really, really great candidates that our members have endorsed. So shout out to Izzy Smith-Waddell and Mark Timmons. These are the best you can hope for in candidates. They show up for every strike line. They're good people. They're just good people, and they're everyday people like us. And the folks who are volunteering and organizing for them right now, next year we are going to be channeling into an electoral program that is going to take, everyday people from across the county and train them to run campaigns, train them to fundraise, train them on communications. How do you talk to your neighbors about these issues and why? And recruit people from the county to run for office. And so that's what we're planning, win or lose this year. And I firmly believe that we can do it. I am a big believer in organizing with like a sense of joy, and that we are on the popular side. We have the policies and the values that everyday people want and can get behind, and we can bring that into the fight and we can win.
It is wonderful to hear that. And yes, we must all believe that we can win. Thank you for this discussion, everyone. Really brilliant insights. Are there any questions? Maybe people have chatted on Zoom or, yes, go ahead.
Yes, so I want to ask you a question. I work with a small group of people and they're going to go to Pennsylvania to do door knocking for particular candidates. And I was wondering from your experience, do you think outsiders coming in does good or bad?
It's good. We had thousands of people come in for the jet skiing campaign. And yes, you should come. Please come knock doors. I'll go with you.
I have another question about Pennsylvania, and it's about the far right and possibly the radicalization of the Republican Party towards the right. Do you, as an activist on the ground, sometimes did you notice a radicalization of Republicans? Do you feel threatened sometimes? And what do you think about what we hear from activists in other swing states like Kansas? Do you feel the need as an activist, as a progressive activist, to arm yourself?
That's a great question. Yes, we have noticed the right wing going more and more extreme, and it seems like every time there's a primary challenge, it's coming from the right now. And there is some really strong organization happening with some really extreme Christian nationalists and, fascists. The thing that we're noticing is, while they haven't been able to win elections, the elected officials because we live in a county that's controlled by Republicans. And some of the people who sit on, school boards and sit on borough councils and board of supervisors and, our county government are very, very friendly with these Christian nationalists and have not really stood up for democracy or free speech. And so, yes, there have been times where I have chosen not to attend a meeting in public. And also told our volunteers not to attend the meeting in public because it's too dangerous to do that. And we see from our elected officials, at least the ones who are far right, that they don't really, it seems like they don't really care about that. And even to the point of receiving death threats, they still don't really speak up for us. And that's very troubling. And I mean, as a leftist, I do consider myself mostly a pacifist, but it's made me be a lot more careful, I will say, about signing in at meetings even and putting my address in places. And sometimes I just get out of town for a week because I get a little nervous sometimes. I have not armed myself, no, but I do know that, a lot of, labor organizers in the 1920s and 30s armed themselves, and Martin Luther King armed himself even. So something to think about.
Yeah, Black Panther Party for self-defense. We don't, if we remember correctly. I believe your hand was up first, sir, and then you afterwards.
All right, thank you so much. It was fascinating listening to you. I'm from Germany, and I also try to draw my own personal lines. Back in Germany, the election took place before the war broke out in Ukraine. I think that's unfortunate because otherwise, looking now at the left in Germany, we are not univocal when it comes to support for the Ukrainian assistance. This war is still ongoing, and I'm wondering to what extent this issue in East Europe is going to affect the midterms, and if so, what is the role of the Democratic Party? Are they more united when it comes to support?
It's such an interesting question. I'll take a short jab at it, and then I think you're probably better positioned. It's because this was actually a question when I was in Germany over the summer. I got asked quite a lot, like, oh, but surely aid to the Ukraine is going to really help in the midterms. And honestly, I could only just laugh. I was like, you think that what the US is doing in Ukraine is going to inform how people are voting for them here? Domestic focus is so profound and often for good reason. I mean, people's lives are at stake, but it is not, it is a matter of proximity, but it is also a matter of inward, I mean, it's not that people aren't following it or people don't care, or that there's not different discussions, both in support of resistance, some quite unpleasant, tanky counter narratives. But no, I do not believe it will be, and I could be wrong, please disagree with me if any of you do. I do not think it will be a decisive factor at all in the midterms, which was surprising to many of the Germans I spoke to. Would you agree?
I would agree. So it is by far not as important as it is at home in Germany. But I want to speak a bit about the elected leftists and how they deal with it. And I would think that they are doing it much smarter than the leftist parliamentarians in Germany. Bernie Sanders was very vocal even before the war has started. He gave a speech at the Senate floor where he was, of course, aware of all the mistakes that NATO has made in the past, and that's all true. But he was very vocal in if here would be a war, then one person is responsible for it. This is Vladimir Putin. And it was the same time when we had a TV show where our most famous leftist politician, Sarah Wagenknecht, was saying, I don't expect that the Russians would invade Ukraine. Why would they? So, and then when it came to decisions, I talked to the international policy advisor of Bernie Sanders, Matt Duss, and he was very clear in he supports the politics of the Biden administration, which in general means we support the Ukrainian resistance, even with military, but we do everything that the NATO or the US is not a direct part of this war. So, and he is aware of the disadvantages of delivering weapons. There's always a bad side of it. If you give away weapons, you cannot control it anymore in the future. But still, and if you look at the decisions made in the Congress, the only no votes against weapon deliveries, against sanctions, they were always from the right wing of the Republicans. So the leftists, including the squad, including the complete progressive caucus, they voted together with the government. And I'm sure not without concerns, rightly so. But in the end, this gives them the freedom, which unfortunately the left party in Germany doesn't have, to focus on the things that are more important for the voters here, because they couldn't be blamed as like the Putin fifth column or whatever. So, of course, in the broader spectrum of the left here, we have debates. Within the DSA, there are different opinions and different statements. And if you go to the broader left, of course, you would find people who would talk more about the mistakes of the NATO and less about the Ukrainian resistance right now. But when it comes to the people who are elected and have to make decisions, they are unified. And I think that was smart.
You also had a question.
I'm from Japan, and the political and also socio-economic landscape is very different from the United States. So it's really interesting hearing you talk about all these issues. But I was just curious. So I think two of you mentioned that the Democratic Party is at a crossroads of it, that they have to choose whether they'll take up the progressive message or not. And I was just wondering, like, do you see any kind of future catalysts that would like hasten this decision, like kind of make it provide an opportunity to show the for the Democratic Party to show where they stand on these issues? I mean, I guess one is the midterm elections, but if there's anything else that the progressive side for the party could do to kind of like hasten their show, like have them show where they are.
I mean, that's a really great question. If I had the answer, I would implement it right now. So I think that I hope it's not like they realize like too late, because they foolishly, what I typically see is the mainstream leadership of the Republican, the Democratic Party will mobilize their political capital and their resources to repress the left, because they would rather be in control of the Democratic Party than win elections.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what the come to Jesus moment is going to be. maybe if there are, because the thing is that like if there's losses, they'll blame the left. If they win, they'll say, oh, even though the left, right? So it's one of those things where it's hard to imagine that happening anytime soon. But what I do think is interesting is that Biden seems to be, right, as Stefan says, like there's a meme on the internet like dark Brandon,
Dark
right?
Brandon.
Which is playing off of the right-wing meme that Joe Biden is like a loser, basically. And so Joe Biden seems to be in his executive position, sort of adopting left positions, which not sure if it's because of his advisors or because he's like, well, I'm not serving for much longer. He's not likely to run again in 2024. Who knows who is, right? And we'll see. Somebody who runs a bunch of numbers for the Democratic Party might say, we need a young person as a running mate. Like, we'll see what the people with the power and the money and the influence decide, hopefully sooner than later. And hopefully it's not a too late, like, you know, in a year or two, the insurrection from the right wing has succeeded. And now people are like, we really should have allowed the left. Like, you know, I hope it's not one of those like tragic moments.
Did you want to answer?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think for me, like the old guard Democratic Party is going to drag their feet as long as they can and not make a decision. And it's up to us to force them to make that decision. And the way to do it is to build a multicultural, multiracial working class coalition big enough to challenge them. And we've made those inroads before. We have a squad that's growing every single time there's an election. We're sending people's champions to Congress and to state houses. And if they won't make that decision, then we'll just have to make it for them. And in this case, it's really up to us.
Yeah, replacement. Also, the one thing about a gerontocracy is that they can't live forever. Like, what is true?
But no.
If you've got a lot of animated corpses, yeah, I mean, how long can you animate a corpse? Ignacio, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question that's just a follow-up to that a little bit. How much would it help if the sort of informal structures right now that are in Congress, let's say the Progressive Caucus, become a little bit more formal? For example, we have like program documents and national conferences so that people doing elections could go out mobilize around that. Because right now, the impression that still is, it's a very informal thing that all different personalities, different names, and they connect and form. So how much would help to bring in a little bit more organization?
May I?
Yeah, I have no idea.
I had the pleasure to talk the person, unfortunately I forgot the name, who was in the first Progressive Caucus ever. He told me about it was in the best times of neoliberalism, and it was just a defense organization. They were just there to, because working class played no role, unions, nothing. It was just like, don't take everything from us. So they were like Bernie and this person, and that's it. And it has evolved in the last years, and especially with the leadership of Pramila Jayapal, what I could see from as a parliamentarian, it was quite clever to bring in the whole power of the caucus in some debates. Of course, there was criticism from the left, and I understand it, that the squad was not happy with it. They changed the time when they made the first decision about the infrastructure plan before they had built back better, and that was criticized. But still, they worked much more as a real power caucus than before. And I would agree, if they do this more, then they would be more powerful. But if I compare the parliament here and the parliament in Germany, it is much more loose here. So every Congress member and every senator is doing what he wants. We have a very strict system of forming a coalition and then voting together. That's not the case here. So, and that could be helpful if the progressives are strong enough to do this and organize, which means making compromises. So it's terrible for all sides. So the one I mentioned before, which is not nice about the police thing, so that is then always, you can only be as powerful as a bloc when you vote as a block.
Mhm.
And that means not everyone can have his point. But I think it would be quite clever to change the part.
Did you have an answer?
Well, I mean, just to reiterate that, we don't have party discipline in the US, right? And so if anyone could figure out a way to make it happen, that would be clever. I mean, basically the way you discipline party members is by primarying them and getting rid of them. But that, because of sort of how decentralized political power and how expensive these races are, it's not easy to do. It's not like there's no centralized authority that's able to make these decisions. So I guess to sort of crib up what Suzy says over and again, that's our job to do this, right? To electorally discipline, you know, people who claim to represent us and don't fight for our interests. So the discipline would have to come from movements.
Making it very unpleasant for them.
But fun for us.
I think that sounds like a great place to end the evening. Thank you again, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. Thank you, Stefan, Suzy, and Susan. It was wonderful to talk to you. Thank you, viewers and audience members, and yeah, well done.
Thank you.